Machine quilted feathers can add an elegant, beautiful touch to your quilts, and quilting them in blocks is easier than you might think. Hi, I'm Angela Walters from Quilting is My Therapy, and I hope you're excited about embarking on a new machine quilting adventure. Fabulous Feathers Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along. We're gonna learn how to quilt feathers in all areas of our quilts, from blocks to backgrounds, irregular spaces, and more. Whether you machine quilt on a sewing machine or a long arm, whether you're a brand new quilter or just looking for some design inspiration, this video series is for you. Best of all, it's absolutely free. In this video, I'm going to show you how to quilt feathers and feather variations in quilt blocks. Machine quilting feathers in blocks is not only a great way to highlight your favorite areas of the quilt, some quilters actually find it easier because we're working within a defined area with a clear starting point and end point. Now, after we're done with this video, we'll have filled in the center of our beautiful Fabulous Feathers panel. I'm going to show you how to quilt it on a sewing machine and a long arm, plus tell you how you can get some free quilting diagrams. So, let's get to it. Not all feathers are for all quilters, but hopefully by the time we're done, I will have set you up with some feathers that you're going to love. I'm not going to lie, I kind of feel like a feather matchmaker. The first design we're going to learn is the basic feather, and really the word basic is a little misleading because this elegant curvy feather looks great in all kinds of blocks. What makes it basic is that there's no traveling and it's quick and easy to quilt. There's a lot of different ways you could go about quilting the basic feather. If you already have a favorite way, don't change it. You do you. I'm going to start by quilting the spine of my feather, stopping before I get to the opposite point and beginning my first petal. Then, using the edge of the block as a guide, I'm going to start quilting my petals, quilting that line so that it goes out and curves back towards the spine, trying to make the line look as though it's merging into that spine. Don't be afraid to really extend those petals out to the edge. As the block gets wider, your petals are going to get larger, and that's perfect. That's exactly how it's supposed to be. Once I have the first side done, I'm going to echo my spine back up to the top and start adding more petals on the other side. And when I'm done, I have a beautiful feather that just looks great in all kinds of blocks. Now, if you're not ready to settle on just a basic feather, you might find this next wonky variation perfect. It takes the same basic feather and shakes it up a bit by creating petals of different widths. This variation is perfect if you're struggling with keeping all your petals the same width. This feather starts the same way as the basic feather. I'm still going to quilt my wavy line up to the top and start quilting my petals down the side. Except I'm going to vary the width of the petals. Some of them will extend closer to the edge, and some of them not so much. The trick here is to make the difference enough that it looks intentional. Doing that is going to leave us with some gaps in between the edge of the block and the design, and this is where echoing is going to come in handy. But before I worry about that, I'm going to quilt the other side of my funky feather. The different widths of those petals give it a fun, funky look. Now it's time to fill in the gaps between the design and the block using echoing. And if I get stuck where I don't have any room to echo out, I'm just going to travel along the edge of my block until I get to where I have room and then add more echo lines. Try this design in larger blocks, irregularly shaped blocks, or on quilts where you just want to add a whimsical touch. And when I'm done, I have a fun, wonky, whimsical feather that's going to look great on my quilts. Now we're going to talk about a custom feather that does add a beautiful, elegant look to your quilt. The main difference is we're going to incorporate a little bit more traveling to this design, and it takes a little bit longer to come together. So I'm definitely going to use this feather and variations in some of my favorite blocks of my quilt. In this particular custom feather, I'm actually going to use the seam of the block as my spine. This is great for highlighting blocks that are pieced well that you want to show off. And I especially love it when I'm dealing with blocks with a lot of contrast in the fabrics. The petals of this feather are quilted in groups of two. One petal goes out, then you travel back along it and quilt your second petal coming back into that spine. Try to quilt those petals so that they come close to the edge without actually running into it. Now, since this block is tinier at the bottom and top than it is in the middle, the petals are going to start out kind of small and get bigger as I work my way up. And I'm going to keep on going and quilting those petals until I end up at the top. I really want this beautiful feather to fill in that whole block. If I do end up with some gaps, I can always add some more echo lines to fill that in. Using the seam of the block as my spine might actually be easier for some quilters since it's always going to be in the same place. Now that I'm at the top, I need to get back to the bottom so I can add petals on the other side. So I'm going to use a little bit of traveling to make that happen. And then once I reach the bottom, I'm going to do the same thing, quilting my petals, working my way up to the top. If you're struggling to get your petals to fit just within the edge of your block without going over, be sure to look ahead of where you're going. You want to begin the curve of your petal before you actually get to the end. So if you find that you're consistently running into the seam, just stop a 1/4 inch short and use echoing to fill it in. So the biggest difference here is, unlike a normal custom feather that I would quilt, I don't have an echoed spine. I just have that one area. I can get a lot of thread building up on that center spine, and that can really draw the attention to that area. So if you're going to try this, be sure to use a blending thread color to help detract from that. I'm using this contrasting thread so you can really see what I'm doing, but if I were actually going to use this on a quilt, I would use a thread color that matched. And when I'm done, I have a big, beautiful custom feather that fits that block perfectly. Now, let's take that same custom feather and give it a curvy spine to give it a different look. That means I'm not going to pay attention to the piecing of the block at all. I'm going to create a curvy spine in the center and use echoing to separate the sides of my feather. This is great if you want to add a little bit of movement to your quilt block, or if it's a quilt block that's not pieced very well, which usually seems to be mine. Now, unlike the previous custom feather, I have to quilt my spine before I start adding my petals. So starting from the top of my block, I'm going to quilt a wavy line to the bottom. This is going to act as the spine of my feather. Now, I like the spine to be nice and curvy, but not too wavy. Once I get to the bottom, I can start working my way up one side, adding my petals. The same way as a custom feather. Now this might be a little trickier because my spine is moving around. It's not always in the same spot like it was on the last feather. But I'm just going to look ahead of where I'm going, and as I see the spine approaching, quilt the line so it looks like it's merging into it. You'll get the hang of it in no time. And as I make my way to the top, petals are going to get smaller and smaller, and then when I run out of room, I know it's time to echo my way back to the bottom and do the same on the other side. Now, I love the look of an echoed spine because this gives a little bit of separation between the sides of the feather and helps keep the thread from building up in that area. And once I'm finished, I have a custom feather that has the same elegant look as the previous one with just a little bit more curves in the center. Now, if this is getting a little overwhelming, don't worry. I actually have a free downloadable quilting diagram and tip sheet that will break this down for you. And if you need a little bit more help, I have an expanded resource that you can purchase with even more diagrams, even more pictures, and even more tips. So be sure to check those out so that you can be successful with quilting these feathers. Let's add a little bit of a swirl to our feather to create a variation that leaves out the traveling. This is perfect if you're struggling with traveling or quilting along that previously quilted line. We're just going to leave it out altogether. Or perhaps you want a slightly more whimsical look to your feather. I'm going to start quilting the petal just like I would for a custom feather, except leave a little space in between the curvy part and the edge of the block. Then echo your way back along the quilted line until you run into the spine. Once that petal's done, I'm going to travel along that spine just a bit and quilt my next petal. Now, in general, I'm trying to make these petals come close to each other, maybe even touch without overlapping, but I'm not too worried about it. Just get it close and move on. So really the main difference is instead of quilting these petals in groups of 2, where one goes out and comes back like the regular custom feather, I'm quilting my petal and then echoing my way back to the spine. For this feather, you can quilt all the petals so that they're curly or alternate between curly ones and regular ones. The choice is up to you. And the result is still a beautiful custom feather that will add an elegant yet whimsical look to your quilt without the traveling. And I say that's a win-win. Well, now that we've seen how to quilt some of these variations on the sewing machine, let's learn a couple more variations on the long arm. When it comes to quilting feathers on a long arm or a sewing machine, there's not a whole lot of difference. The design still goes together the same way. The biggest difference that you'll find is on a long arm, you can't change the orientation of your quilt easily. That means you're going to have to learn how to quilt your feathers in all different directions. But don't let that scare you. After a little bit of practice, you'll be whipping those feathers around like no problem. First up, let's revisit that swirly variation and see what it looks like with a curvy spine. Instead of using the seam down the middle as a spine, I'm going to add that curvy line. I'm still quilting my swirl and echoing my way back. Another thing that some quilters find difficult about quilting on the long arm is that there's so much freedom of movement. So it can be kind of difficult to confine your feathers into the spaces of your blocks. The best tip I have is to look ahead of where you're quilting. So don't look directly at the needle, look in the direction you're heading so you can see when you're getting close to that edge. If you run out of room to fit the whole petal, just quilt a curved line up to the top and echo your way back down the side. The most important thing is that you fill in the area as much as possible. Since this design is so fun and whimsical, it's very forgiving. So don't stress out about making any mistakes because once you're done, you'll have this beautiful, curly, custom type feather. So now let's talk about another custom feather variation that gets right to the point. This starts out the same as the custom feather. Quilting a small petal, traveling back along it, and then quilting another petal back. And I'm going to keep doing that, trying to fill in the area as much as possible. But then, when you're ready to go back to the spine, instead of quilting a round feather, quilt one that goes out to a point, and then continue quilting as normal, traveling and adding another petal. I like to alternate between normal petals and pointy petals, but you can quilt them all pointy if you want. It's just going to incorporate a little bit of traveling around those points. Play around with the placement and find what you like. Another difference between quilting this design on a sewing machine and a long arm is that I'm going to use a ruler to help me travel back along the spine. I love to use this variation on more masculine quilts or when I just want to shake things up a bit and add a few points. So with this curly feather, whether you give it a straight spine or a curvy spine, the result is still beautiful. Now it's your turn. Are you ready for a free motion challenge? Fill in the center blocks with the feather or feather variations of your choice. You can make them all the same, try out all the variations, or come up with your own. The choice is up to you. And don't forget, if you need a little bit more help, check out the free downloadable tip sheet and quilting diagrams for this video. And you can find the link to that in the description box below. If you have any questions, be sure to leave them in the comments below because I pop on there from time to time to answer them and help you out. And I'll be back next week with the next video in the Fabulous Feathers Free Motion Challenge, where I'll show you how to create a feather meander to fill in the area around our blocks. Plus, we'll learn how to use different thread colors to give it a unique thread painted look. Until then, happy quilting!